The secret to ancient Egyptian timekeeping lies in the perfect gradient of a stone vessel, where every drop was a calculated movement of physics. This isn't just a history lesson. It's a journey into a mechanical pulse that has beat for millennia. Prepare to sleep as we trace the flow of water through history's most elegant engineering. Welcome back, traveler, to Boring History, a quiet corner of the world where we leave behind the noise of today and gently wander into the stillness of the past. Here the fires of history burn low and steady, casting long shadows over forgotten stories. We are not here for kings and conquests, but for the quiet, strange, and sometimes unsettling moments that time nearly buried. Before you get comfy, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, only if you're actually enjoying it. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'm always curious to see the mix of places and time zones hanging out here together. Chapter I. Before the clock. There was the sun. There is a particular quality of light that falls on the Nile Valley in the hour before dawn. It arrives slowly, without announcement, seeping up from beneath the eastern horizon like water rising through stone. The darkness does not break so much as it dissolves, first into a deep, uncertain blue, then into grey, then into the pale gold that ancient Egyptians understood as the first breath of the sun god Ra, stirring in his bark somewhere below the world, preparing to ascend once more into the sky. For the people who lived along that river for 3,000 years and more, this moment, the moment of first light, was not merely beautiful, it was the fundamental unit of time. It was the tick of the largest clock in existence. Long before any human hand shaped stone into a vessel or scratched a mark into a wall to record the passing of an hour, the sky above Egypt told time with perfect, indifferent authority. The sun rose, it arced, it fell. In that arc, a day was defined, not as an abstract quantity of minutes and seconds, but as a lived experience, a cycle of warmth and cold, of labor and rest, of visibility and darkness. The Nile farmer who planted emmer wheat in the black, fertile soil left behind by the annual flood did not need to know that the sun had been above the horizon for exactly 6 hours. He needed to know that the heat of the day was past, that the shadows were lengthening, that it was time to stop digging and walk back to the village before the desert cold set in. The sun told him all of this, freely, every day, without fail. For most of human prehistory, this was sufficient. The rhythms of agricultural life are broad rhythms. The seasons come and go on a scale of weeks and months, not hours and minutes. A farmer needs to know when to plant, when to harvest, when to expect the flood, and for these purposes, the gradual shift of the sun's position on the horizon from one month to the next, the appearance of certain stars at dusk, the flooding of the Nile itself in high summer, provided all the temporal information a community required. Time, in the Neolithic world, was a landscape you moved through. It was not something you measured, but Egypt was not content to remain a Neolithic landscape. Somewhere in the long centuries of the 4th millennium BCE, along the full length of the Nile from the delta in the north to the cataracts in the south, a transformation was underway that would eventually produce one of the most administratively sophisticated civilizations the ancient world ever saw. Villages grew into towns, towns grew into regional centers. Regional centers, eventually and violently, consolidated into a unified state. The two lands, Upper and Lower Egypt, brought together under a single ruler whose power extended across hundreds of miles of river valley and desert. This consolidation, which tradition places around 3100 BCE, with the reign of a king named Nama or Menes, required coordination on a scale that no previous Egyptian society had attempted. Coordination requires time. Not the broad, seasonal time of the farmer, but the specific, subdivided, recorded time of the bureaucrat. When the central government needed grain from a distant province, it needed to know when the grain shipment had departed, how long it had been in transit, and when it was expected to arrive. When the Pharaoh's court scheduled an audience with a foreign dignitary, the timing of that audience had significance, diplomatic, political, astronomical. When the priests of a great temple needed to perform the morning ritual of washing the god's statue before sunrise, they needed to know, on any given morning, how much time remained before the sun appeared. The broad sweep of day and night was not enough. What was needed was subdivision, the ability to say not simply it is daytime but it is 3 hours before midday, not simply the night has begun but it is the 4th hour of darkness. The Egyptians developed several ingenious methods for achieving this subdivision before they arrived at the water clock, and it is worth tracing that intellectual journey, because it illuminates the specific problem that water eventually solved. The shadow clock. sometimes called a merket, was among the earliest daylight timekeeping instruments. In its simplest form, it was merely a stick planted vertically in the ground. The shadow cast by the stick, the gnomon, moved as the sun moved. In the morning the shadow was long and pointed west. At midday it was at its shortest, pointing north or nearly so. In the afternoon it lengthened again, now pointing east. By observing the length and direction of the shadow, a skilled observer could estimate the time of day with reasonable accuracy. Later, more sophisticated versions of the shadow clock used a horizontal bar with a raised crosspiece at one end, held toward the sunrise in the morning and toward the sunset in the afternoon. The crosspiece cast a shadow along the graduated bar, and the position of that shadow indicated the hour. These devices were practical, portable, and required no maintenance. They worked anywhere the sun shone. Egyptian officials used them, military commanders used them, priests used them in the open courtyards of temples, where the sun reached the floor. But the shadow clock had a fundamental and insurmountable limitation. It ceased to function the moment the sun disappeared. On overcast days, the shadow was faint or absent entirely. On partially cloudy days, the shadow flickered in and out, giving inconsistent readings. And at night, in the long, theologically and ritually significant nighttime hours that were so important to Egyptian religious life, the shadow clock was perfectly, completely useless. There was no shadow, there was only darkness. For the nighttime hours, the Egyptians developed a different system, based not on the sun but on the stars. The technique involved the use of a sighting instrument, a plumb line held vertically, through which an observer could align their line of sight with a distant marker, usually another observer seated at a measured distance to the north. By watching which stars rose above the observer's head, or crossed certain defined points in the sky, the astronomer could count the hours of the night. The system was remarkably precise for its era. Egyptian astronomical texts from the Middle Kingdom period list the star transits that marked each hour of the night for every 10-day interval of the year, a complete calendar of stellar timekeeping compiled through years of dedicated observation. This system, too, had significant limitations. It required a trained astronomer, a clear sky, and a stationary observation point. You could not use it inside a building. You could not use it on a cloudy night. You could not use it if you were on the move, traveling, campaigning, working by torchlight in a tomb or a granary or an underground treasury. It was an astronomical instrument, suited to astronomical purposes, not to the daily management of time in a complex, bustling, largely indoor civilization. And so, at some point, and historians cannot say with certainty exactly when, because the earliest examples have not survived, and written references are sparse and indirect, someone in Egypt thought of water. Water was everywhere along the Nile. Water was the medium through which Egyptian civilization itself had been created. The annual inundation that deposited the rich black soil, the Kemat, the black land, which gave the country its very identity. Water was managed, channeled, stored, measured, and intimately understood by Egyptian engineers who had been building irrigation systems for thousands of years. If you needed to control the flow of something, you turned to water. You knew how it behaved. You knew how to shape it, direct it, and contain it. The insight that made the water clock possible was simple. Water, given a small hole to escape through, drips at a rate that is related to the height of the water above the hole. It does not drip randomly. It drips with a regularity that, in a well-made vessel with a carefully sized hole, approaches the kind of consistency needed to measure time. A vessel that empties in 12 hours, or fills in 12 hours, can be marked at the point where each hour passes. Those marks become a clock face. The vessel becomes a timepiece. The beauty of this insight was its accessibility. You did not need to see the sun. You did not need a clear sky. You did not need a trained astronomer staring at the stars through a sighting tube. You needed a vessel, a hole, water, and a set of marks. You could use it inside. You could use it at night. You could use it in a sandstorm, in a rainstorm, behind the thick stone walls of a temple in a sanctum lit only by the flickering of oil lamps. The water did not care about the weather. It simply dripped. This was the revolution. Not dramatic, not violent, not announced with any fanfare that the archaeological record has preserved. Simply a hole in the bottom of a vessel, and the quiet observation that time could be measured by the falling of water. By the time of the New Kingdom, by roughly 1550 BCE, when Egypt was at the height of its imperial power, and the great temples of Luxor and Karnak were rising, on the Theban plain, the water clock was already a mature and well-developed technology. The Karnak clepsydrae of Amenhotep III, which survives today in Cairo and is the earliest complete example we have, is not a primitive prototype. It is a refined instrument, with precisely calculated taper, carefully observed seasonal markings, and decorative sophistication that implies a long tradition behind it. You do not make something that elegant on your first attempt. The instrument we have is the product of generations of experimentation that left no direct trace, only its culmination in stone. We should pause, before moving on, to let the full weight of what was accomplished settle. Before the water clock, the night was largely immeasurable. Priests sat in the dark and waited for dawn. Guards completed their rounds by feel and instinct. Rituals were performed at the right time in only the broadest sense. The night was a void necessary, theologically significant, but ungoverned by the kind of precision that daytime, with its shadows and its sun, permitted. The water clock gave the night a skeleton. It gave the darkness 12 bones, 12 hours, 12 marks that a priest could read by the light of a lamp without going outside, without looking at the sky, without disturbing the sacred silence of the inner temple. It did not illuminate the night, but it measured it. And in a civilization as obsessed with order, hierarchy, and the proper performance of ritual as ancient Egypt, measurement was itself a form of mastery. The sun had always owned the day. Now, for the first time, human beings owned the night. Chapter 2. The Shape of an Egyptian Hour. If you were to step back in time to ancient Egypt and ask a priest in the temple of Amra at Karnak what time it was, his answer would confuse you. Not because he did not know the answer, he would know it precisely, from the water level, in the vessel, in the inner sanctuary, but because the unit of time he gave you, the hour, would mean something fundamentally different from what that word means today. It would be longer in summer than in winter. It would be longer in the night than in the day for half the year, and longer in the day than in the night for the other half. It would, if you tried to convert it into modern minutes, give you a different answer depending on what month it was, and whether you were asking about a daytime hour or a nighttime hour. The hour, in ancient Egypt, was not a fixed container. It was an elastic, seasonal, relational unit, and understanding this is essential to understanding every aspect of Egyptian timekeeping, including the water clock. To grasp why, begin with the sun. The Egyptian day was defined by two fixed points, sunrise and sunset. Between those 2 points, the span of daylight was divided into 12 equal parts. Whatever the actual duration of that span on any given day, it was called 12 hours. In high summer in Egypt, sunrise comes early, around 5 in the morning by modern reckoning, and sunset comes late, around 7 in the evening. The total span of daylight is roughly 14 modern hours, divided into 12 Egyptian hours. Each Egyptian day hour in midsummer lasts approximately 70 minutes. In midwinter, by contrast, the day might span only 10 modern hours, and each day hour would be only about 50 minutes long. The night was governed by the same principle, in reverse. From sunset to sunrise was 12 hours, regardless of how long that span actually was. A midsummer night in Egypt is roughly 10 modern hours. Each of those 10 hours is divided into 12 Egyptian night hours, of approximately 50 minutes each. A midwinter night of 14 hours gives 12 night hours of roughly 70 minutes each. The mathematics here is beautifully symmetrical and maddening in practice. When the day hours are long, the night hours are short. When the night hours are long, the day hours are short. The total of day hours plus night hours always sums to 24 units. But those 24 units cover 24 modern hours only twice a year at the equinoxes, when day and night are equal in length, and each Egyptian hour is almost exactly 60 minutes. Modern historians call this system seasonal hours, or temporal hours, and it was essentially universal in the ancient world. The Greeks used it, the Romans used it, medieval Europe used it. The system persisted as the dominant way of dividing the day until the mechanical clock made equal hours practical for everyday use, and even then, the transition was slow, contested, and occurred at different times in different parts of Europe. The move from seasonal to equal hours is one of the most quietly significant intellectual transitions in Western history, and it happened because a machine made equal hours easy to track, not because anyone had demonstrated that equal hours were philosophically superior. For the Egyptians, seasonal hours were not a limitation. They were the only logical system imaginable. The day was the day. The night was the night. Dividing each into 12 equal parts respected the natural cycle, the fundamental rhythm of Egyptian life, tied to sunrise and sunset, to work and sleep, to the passage of the sun through the sky and through the underworld. A fixed hour, identical at midnight and at noon, identical in January and in July, would have felt not more precise but less real, a mathematical abstraction divorced from the living experience of time on the Nile. But for the water clock, this system posed a profound and immediate engineering challenge. Imagine you are building a water clock for nighttime use, which was the primary purpose of the Egyptian clepsydrae. You want your vessel to drip through the night, passing a series of marks that tell you which hour has arrived. If you build your vessel with 12 equally spaced marks, and your vessel empties in a fixed amount of time, then each mark will represent the same duration. That is fine, but in which month? If your vessel empties in 10 modern hours, the length of a midsummer night, then your marks will be correctly spaced only in midsummer. In midwinter, when the night is 14 modern hours long, your vessel will run dry for modern hours before dawn, and you will have no clock for the last third of the night. Alternatively, if you calibrate for midwinter and your vessel takes 14 modern hours to empty, it will still be half full when dawn arrives in midsummer. There is no static solution to this problem. A single vessel with a single set of marks, designed to run for a fixed duration, cannot correctly tell 12 variable hours across a variable length night throughout the year. Something must flex. Either the vessel must be larger or smaller depending on the season, or the marks must be differently spaced depending on the season, or the rate at which water drips must be varied by opening and closing the hole. In practice, the Egyptians used the second solution, different marks for different months. The full implication of this is extraordinary. The interior surface of an Egyptian water clock was not marked with a single column of 12 evenly spaced lines. It was marked with 12 columns of 12 lines each, one column for each month of the Egyptian calendar. The lines within each column were spaced differently, reflecting the different duration of the night hours in that month. In the column for midsummer, the marks were closely spaced near the top of the vessel, where the water level drops quickly early in the night, and more widely spaced near the bottom. In the column for midwinter, the same marks were arranged differently, reflecting the longer hours of the longer night. To produce these marks correctly required observing the sky over a full year. Egyptian astronomers, the priests, who served simultaneously as calendar keepers, star watchers and timekeepers, tracked a specific set of stars called the decans. There were 36 of these decan stars or star groups, chosen because each one made its first visible appearance on the eastern horizon just before dawn at approximately 10-day intervals across the year. By noting which decan was rising at each moment of the night, an astronomer could count the hours over the course of months by recording where the water level stood in a test vessel each time a decan rose. The astronomer accumulated the data needed to mark the vessel correctly. This was not a simple or quick undertaking. It required year-round observation, consistent recording, careful averaging across multiple nights to smooth out individual measurement errors, and the skill to translate astronomical observations into the geometry of a stone vessel. The men who produced the Karnak, clepsydrae, and others like it were among the most sophisticated scientific practitioners of their era, not because they had the benefit of modern mathematics, but because they did without it what modern mathematics merely makes easier. It is also worth noting what the Deccan system implied about Egyptian astronomical knowledge. The Egyptians were not primitive stargazers squinting at the sky with vague admiration. They had catalogued 36 specific stars, or star groups, whose behavior they tracked systematically across the entire year. They knew the pattern of heliacal risings, the way stars appear to shift their relationship with the sun over the course of the year as Earth moves in its orbit. Though the Egyptians explained this differently, they could predict, with useful accuracy, which star would be rising at a given hour on a given date. This predictive capacity was not derived from theory, but from extended empirical observation, the slow, patient accumulation of data about the sky that required generations of dedicated record-keeping. The water clock, then, was not a standalone invention. It was the physical embodiment of an astronomical tradition. The marks on the vessel were a translation from the language of stars to the language of water levels. The two systems, stellar timekeeping by night and hydraulic timekeeping by night, were complementary. The stars provided the calibration data, and the water clock made that data practically accessible to anyone with a vessel and a lamp, without requiring astronomical skill or clear sky conditions. There is also a deeper theological resonance in the choice of 12 hours for each half of the day. 12 was not an arbitrary number. The Egyptians were aware, from their own astronomical observations, that the ecliptic, the path of the sun through the sky, passed through approximately 12 constellations or star groups in the course of a year. The number 12 had cosmic significance, reflecting the structure of the heavens. To divide the night into 12 hours was not merely practical. It was a statement about the relationship between earthly time and celestial order, a declaration that the hours counted in the temple corresponded to the great divisions of the sky above it. The hour, in other words, was not a convenient administrative unit. It was a unit of cosmic architecture, rooted in the structure of the zodiac, the behavior of the decanas, and the theology of a civilization that saw time not as a human invention, but as a divine order that human beings were privileged to observe and required to honor. When an Egyptian priest read the hour from a water clock in the small hours of the morning, he was not simply checking the time. He was reading the universe. He was confirming his place in a structure that extended from the water in the vessel, through the marks on its wall, across the night sky above the temple, and into the theological architecture of creation itself. The shape of an Egyptian hour was, therefore, not merely a matter of minutes. It was a matter of meaning. Chapter 3. The inflow, clepsydrae. Water rising among all the surviving objects of ancient Egypt, the painted tomb walls, the gilded funeral masks, the towering granite colossi. The water clock is perhaps the most quietly underestimated. It does not dazzle. It does not proclaim the power of a pharaoh. It sits in its museum case, a battered stone vessel with faded marks on its interior, and asks nothing of the viewer except attention, and the willingness to think carefully about a whole. The specific genius of the Egyptian water clock lies entirely in that whole, its size, its position, and the shape of the vessel that surrounds it. To understand the inflow clepsydrae, the earliest and most sophisticated type, you need to understand why that hole presented a problem that took considerable intellectual effort to solve. The fundamental principle of the inflow clepsydrae is straightforward. A vessel with a small hole near its base loses water slowly and steadily. A second vessel, placed below the first or connected to it by a channel, receives that dripping water. As the water level in the receiving vessel rises, it passes a series of marks on the interior wall. Each mark represents 1 hour. You read time by looking at the water level in the bottom vessel and finding which mark it corresponds to. Simple, clean, obvious, and deeply problematic. For a reason that becomes clear the moment you think about how water actually flows. Water flows through a small hole faster when the water pressure above the hole is higher, and the pressure at the base of a vessel, the pressure that drives the water through the hole, is directly proportional to the height of the water above it. A full vessel, with a tall column of water above the hole, pushes water through quickly. A nearly empty vessel, with only a shallow depth of water remaining, pushes water through slowly. This relationship in modern physics, described by Torricelli's theorem, formulated in the 17th century, was not known to the Egyptians in any mathematical form, but it was visible to anyone who watched a vessel drain. The drip starts fast and slows as the vessel empties. This variation presents a catastrophic problem for a timekeeper. If the water level in your upper vessel drops quickly at first and slowly later, then the water rising in your lower vessel also rises quickly at first and slowly later. A mark that represents 1 hour near the beginning of the night, when the upper vessel is full and dripping fast, will be positioned at a different vertical distance from the previous mark than a mark near the end of the night, when the vessel is nearly empty and dripping slowly. If you simply space your marks equally up the wall of the lower vessel, your clock will run fast in the first hours and slow in the last hours, giving you wildly inconsistent results by the time dawn arrives. You could, of course, simply accept this inaccuracy and space the marks unevenly to compensate using your stellar observations to determine where each mark should actually go, regardless of where equal spacing would put it. The marks would then be unevenly distributed across the vessel wall, but they would be correct. This approach requires no understanding of the physics involved. It requires only patient empirical calibration, filling the vessel, watching the stars, and marking the vessel wall when each stellar hour arrives. There is evidence that some Egyptian water clocks were calibrated this way, at least in part. The marks on certain surviving vessels are not evenly spaced, and the uneven spacing follows a pattern consistent with Torricelli's law, even though no Egyptian text mentions anything resembling Torricelli. The craftsman observed the phenomenon without naming it, compensated for it without theorizing it, and produced a working instrument without understanding, in any abstract sense, why it worked. But the most sophisticated Egyptian water clocks went further. They addressed the problem not through calibration correction after the fact, but through design, by changing the shape of the vessel to control the flow rate from the beginning. The Karnak clepsydrae of Amenhotep III is the most celebrated surviving example of this design approach. The vessel is conical, wider at the top and narrower at the base. This taper is not decorative, it is functional, and its function is to counteract the variation in flow rate caused by changing water pressure. Here is the logic. As the water level in the vessel drops, the pressure at the hole decreases and the flow rate decreases. But simultaneously, because the vessel is wider at the top than at the bottom, the volume of water represented by each unit of vertical drop decreases as the vessel empties. In the wide upper portion, dropping the water level by 1 centimeter removes a large volume of water, because the cross-sectional area is large. In the narrow lower portion, dropping the water level by 1 centimeter removes only a small volume of water, because the cross-sectional area is small. If the taper is correctly calculated, these two effects, decreasing pressure reducing flow rate, and decreasing cross-section reducing the volume per unit of height, can partially cancel each other out. The slower drip in the nearly empty vessel still drops the water level by approximately the same vertical distance per hour as the faster drip in the full vessel. The marks can be evenly spaced. The clock ticks more consistently. This is not perfect. Modern analysis of ancient water clocks reveals that Egyptian craftsmen achieved only partial compensation. The taper they used reduces but does not eliminate the variation. A perfect Torricellian correction would require a parabolic cross-section, a curve that the Egyptians did not compute and may not have attempted. But the conical taper they did use represents a real engineering insight, empirically derived and practically effective. Their clock was significantly more accurate than an untapered vessel would have been. The Karnak vessel itself is carved from a single block of stone, a dark, dense stone that has been identified as alabastrian limestone. It stands approximately 30 centimeters tall, with a base diameter somewhat narrower than its rim. The interior surface, remarkably, still shows traces of the original marks, 12 columns of 12 marks each, corresponding to the 12 months of the Egyptian calendar. The hole at the base is small, carefully drilled, and positioned at a point that balances the competing demands of slow, consistent flow and sufficient total volume to last a full night. The exterior of the vessel is decorated. Around the upper rim, baboon figures are carved in relief, the baboon being sacred to Thoth, god of wisdom, writing, and time. Beneath the baboons, astronomical figures and texts identify the months and hours. The decoration is not mere ornament, it is documentation, a permanent inscription of the astronomical knowledge encoded in the marks, identifying which column belongs to which month, which mark belongs to which hour. The vessel is simultaneously a timepiece and a textbook. The choice of stone for the Karnak clock was itself significant. Stone does not warp, swell, or contract with changes in humidity. It does not rot. It maintains its shape and its marks across centuries. The Egyptians also made water clocks in clay and, for wealthier patrons, in alabaster, the translucent white calcite that glows softly in lamplight. Each material had its advantages and drawbacks. Clay was cheap and easy to produce, but fragile and porous over time. Alabaster was beautiful and translucent. You could see the water level through the stone itself in a thin-walled vessel, but expensive and difficult to carve with precision. Stone was durable and precise, but heavy and entirely opaque, requiring the reader to lean over the rim to check the interior marks. The inside of the inflow clock also required periodic cleaning, because the interior surface where the marks were placed was perpetually wet. Over time, lime deposits from the water could accumulate on the marks, obscuring them. Algae could grow on the wet stone. The attending priest would need to clean the vessel regularly, carefully, so as not to damage the marks, and refill the upper vessel at the start of each night. This maintenance routine was itself a kind of knowledge, passed from one priest to the next, preserving not just the physical instrument but the practice of its use. The social context of the inflow clepsydrae is important to understand. It was not a device for individual use. It was institutional. It required a dedicated location, the inner sanctuary of a temple, where it could be placed securely, monitored without interruption, and refilled from a reliable water supply. It required an attendant whose sole or primary nighttime duty was to watch it, read it, and act upon its readings. In the large temples of Karnak and Luxor, this duty likely fell to junior priests in rotation. young men who had not yet earned the seniority to perform the major rituals, but who could be trusted to sit in a dim room and watch a stone vessel drip. For these young priests, the water clock was not a marvel. It was a night shift. The water for the clock was not ordinary Nile water. River water, particularly during and after the annual inundation, was laden with sediment, mud, organic material, sand that would quickly clog a small hole or deposit mineral residue inside the vessel. Clean water for timekeeping purposes likely came from wells or cisterns, where the sediment had settled out and the water was clear. In large temple complexes, which typically maintained their own water storage systems for ritual purposes, sacred lakes were a common feature of major temples. Clean water was readily available. In smaller temples or field contexts, obtaining suitable water was more challenging. The angle of the outflow hole also mattered. If the hole was perfectly horizontal, bored straight through the base of the vessel, the water draining from it would follow a horizontal path before falling, potentially spraying rather than dripping cleanly into the lower vessel. If angled slightly downward, the outflow would be more controlled. The position of the hole relative to the base also affected whether the last shallow depth of water in the vessel would drain completely or leave a residual puddle that distorted the final hour's reading. These are small details, but in a timekeeping device, small details accumulate into measurable error. The Egyptian craftsmen who made these instruments are entirely anonymous to us. Their names were not recorded. Their techniques were not written down in any surviving manual. We know they existed because their work exists, because the vessel in Cairo is precisely tapered and carefully marked and shows signs of extensive use. We know they were skilled because the instrument works, even now, after 33 centuries. But we know nothing of the workshop where it was made, the hierarchy of craft knowledge that produced it, or the name of the man or woman who held the chisel. This anonymity is a common feature of ancient technology. The most important practical inventions of the ancient world were made by people whose names history did not consider worth preserving. Kings were named, generals were named, high priests were named. The craftsmen who shaped the tools of civilization were, with rare exceptions, absorbed into the nameless mass of human labor. The Karnak clepsydrae is their monument nevertheless, not to any individual, but to the capacity of human observation and human ingenuity to bend the simple fact of dripping water into a mechanism for ordering time. 33 centuries later, you can hold it in your hands, and if you fill it with water and watch, the water will fall at roughly the right rate, and the marks will arrive at roughly the right intervals, and you will understand, in a way that no amount of description can fully communicate, what it meant to have invented it. Chapter 4. The outflow clepsydrae. Water falling. The inflow clepsydrae, for all its elegance, was a device that demanded resources. It required 2 vessels, one to drip from, one to catch, or at minimum, 1 vessel and a connected channel system. It required a stable installation, a reliable water supply, and the maintenance of a continuous transfer of water from the upper vessel to the lower one throughout the night. For the great temples with their trained staffs and abundant resources, this was entirely manageable. For everyone else, it was cumbersome. What was needed, what the smaller temples, the traveling officials, the military commanders, the provincial administrators of a far-flung empire needed, was something simpler. The outflow clepsydrae provided it, in its simplest and most fundamental form. The outflow clepsydrae is a single vessel filled with water. Near the base of the vessel, a small hole is drilled. Water drips out through that hole, slowly and continuously, over the course of a night. As the water drips out, the level inside the vessel falls. On the interior wall of the vessel, a series of marks record the positions of the water surface at each successive hour. To read the time, you look inside the vessel and find which mark the water surface is nearest to. That is your hour. 1 vessel, 1 hole, no second container required, no water to transfer or manage. Fill it at the start of the night, set it somewhere secure and level, and it will count the hours until it is empty or until dawn arrives, whichever comes first. This simplicity made the outflow clepsydrae the workhorse of Egyptian timekeeping. The inflow clock was the precision instrument, the calibrated masterwork built for the inner sanctuary of a major temple. The outflow clock was the practical tool, the thing a traveling priest packed in his kit, the thing a provincial temple bought when it could not afford the resources for the more complex design, the thing a military officer's attendant carried in a padded container along with his writing supplies and personal effects. The earliest surviving outflow clepsydrae we have, actually the oldest surviving water clock of any type, is the one found at Karnak and attributed to Amenhotep III, already discussed. But examples of outflow clepsydrae are more numerous in the archaeological record than inflow designs, and they come from a wider range of contexts, not just great temples, but smaller cult sites, administrative buildings, and contexts that suggest non-priestly use. This distribution confirms what the design itself suggests. The outflow clock was the common form. The mechanics of the outflow clock, however, concealed exactly the same fundamental problem as the inflow design, now playing out in reverse. In an inflow clock, the variable drip rate caused the lower vessel to fill unevenly, quickly at first, slowly at the end. In an outflow clock, the variable drip rate causes the single vessel to empty unevenly, quickly at first, slowly at the end. The water level drops faster in the early hours of the night, when the vessel is full and the pressure at the hole is high, and slower in the late hours, when the vessel is nearly empty and the pressure is low. If you mark the interior of the vessel with equally spaced lines and fill it at the start of the night, the first hours will go by quickly, the water will reach the second and third marks faster than you expect, and the last hours will drag, the water crawling down toward the final marks at a pace that seems, if you are watching, almost stagnant. Your clock will be fast in the early evening and slow in the early morning, giving the impression that the universe has unequal enthusiasm for different parts of the night. The same solutions available for the inflow clock apply here. The empirical solution observe the stellar hours, mark the vessel where the water stands at each hour, except the uneven spacing is available and was certainly used. Many surviving outflow vessels have marks that are not evenly spaced, and the pattern of spacing, when analyzed, is consistent with the physics of Torricellian outflow. But the geometric solution, the tapered vessel, was also applied to outflow clocks. The principle is identical in concept. If the vessel is wider at the top and narrower at the bottom, the rate at which the water level falls will be modulated by the changing cross-section. In the wide upper portion, the slower drip rate of a nearly full vessel is compensated by the fact that a large volume must exit before the water level drops by 1 unit of height. As the vessel empties and the cross-section narrows, the water level falls faster per unit volume exiting, which compensates for the decreasing pressure and slowing drip rate. The result, with a correctly calculated taper, is a water level that falls at a roughly constant rate over the course of the night. Here, however, there is an interesting practical difference between inflow and outflow designs that affects how the taper is applied. In an inflow clock, the marks are on the lower vessel, the one that fills. In an outflow clock, the marks are on the upper vessel, the one that empties. This means that the craftsman making an outflow clock must taper the single vessel in a way that simultaneously serves as both the drip mechanism and the reading surface. The taper must make the drip consistent and make the marks readable. This is a more demanding design constraint than the inflow clock, where the taper of the upper vessel affects the drip rate but the marks are on the lower, untapered vessel. The solution most commonly found in surviving outflow clepsydrae is the same truncated cone used in inflow clocks, wider at the top, narrower at the base. In some examples, the taper is gentle and nearly cylindrical. In others, it is pronounced. The variation across different vessels suggests that different craftsmen applied the principle with different levels of precision and understanding. Some copying established shapes without fully understanding the physics, others refining the taper through testing until the marks came out evenly. The marks themselves, on an outflow clock, read in the opposite direction from an inflow clock. In an inflow clock, the first hour of the night is at the bottom of the receiving vessel. The water has not yet risen far, and the 12th hour is at the top. You look down and read upward as the night progresses. In an outflow clock, the first hour of the night is at the top of the single vessel. The water is nearly full, and the 12th hour is near the bottom. You look down and read downward, watching the water's surface sink toward the marks representing the small hours of the morning. This directionality has a subtle psychological dimension. The inflow clock, with its rising water, has an optimistic cast. Time is accumulating, the night is filling up. The outflow clock, with its falling water, is more elegiac. Time is draining away, the night is emptying. Whether any Egyptian priest or official ever articulated this distinction in those terms, we cannot know. But the observation is worth making, because the experience of using these two designs was fundamentally different, and different experiences of time produced different relationships with it. the use of the outflow clock extended beyond temple ritual into contexts that we might more readily recognize as modern. In Egyptian administrative life, in the management of workers, the scheduling of labor shifts, the coordination of activities at building sites, the outflow clock provided the kind of specific hour-level temporal reference that written records sometimes required. The Deir el-Medina papyri, the extraordinary administrative archive left behind by the artisans who built the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, are filled with daily records of attendance, work hours, and output. While the papyri do not mention water clocks explicitly in every context, the precision with which working time was recorded in some documents suggests access to a more reliable time measurement than simple solar observation could provide in the narrow shaded valleys where the tombs were cut. A water clock placed at the entrance to a worksite, a simple outflow vessel, refilled at the beginning of each shift, with its marks visible to the foreman in charge of recording attendance, would have transformed the administration of labor. Instead of user hat arrived after the sun had risen, the record could read user hat arrived 2 hours into the morning shift. This is a modest improvement in precision, perhaps, but in an administrative culture that depended on written records for everything from tax collection to the allocation of rations to the adjudication of disputes, modest improvements in precision accumulated into substantial improvements in governance. The outflow clock also had ceremonial and public uses that the inflow clock, with its two-vessel complexity, could not easily serve. At public announcements, at the timing of festivals, at the formal opening and closing of administrative sessions in courts or councils, a single vessel placed visibly in a courtyard or hall could provide a shared temporal reference for everyone present. The level of water in the vessel was a fact visible to all, not a reading taken privately by a specialist and announced to an audience who had to take his word for it, but a directly observable piece of information that any literate person who knew what the marks meant could verify for themselves. This public legibility of the outflow clock made it, in a sense, the first democratically readable timepiece in history. The sundial, its daylight counterpart, shared this quality. You could look at a sundial and read the time yourself, without an intermediary, and this public accessibility was part of what made both instruments culturally significant beyond their purely practical function. The clock was not just a tool, it was a shared reference point, a common language of time that allowed a complex society to coordinate itself across distances and institutions. There is also the question of aesthetics. The outflow, clepsydrae, precisely because it was the common, everyday design, was the type most often decorated, personalized, and made beautiful. The wealthier the patron, the more elaborate the decoration. Alabaster vessels were carved with figures of kneeling priests, their upraised arms supporting the vessel as if holding up the night sky. The marks on the interior were sometimes framed with hieroglyphic texts, identifying the months and hours. Some vessels had gilded rims or inlaid color in the marks. The baboon-mouthed designs, where the outflow hole was formed through the open mouth of a carved thoth baboon, appear in outflow designs as well as inflow ones. These decorations were not merely vanity. In Egyptian material culture, beauty and function were not opposed categories. An object that served a sacred or important administrative purpose was required to be beautiful, because the Egyptian concept of ma'at, the cosmic order of truth, justice, and rightness, encompassed aesthetics as well as ethics. A beautiful water clock was a more truthful water clock. It honored the gods whose cosmic order it was designed to reflect. It expressed the seriousness and dignity of the institution that owned it. An ugly clock, made carelessly, would have been seen not just as ungraceful, but as somehow improper, not fully aligned with the order of things that it was supposed to serve. We might also note, in passing, that the outflow clepsydrae had a particular intimacy that its larger, more complex counterpart lacked. The inflow clock required a room, an installation, an attendant, a routine. The outflow clock could, in principle, be set on any flat surface, filled from any clean water source, and left to drip in the quiet. A priest, using an outflow clock in the small hours of the morning, alone in a sanctuary lit by a single lamp, sat with a vessel that was slowly, visibly emptying. The water going out was the night going by. Each mark the surface passed was another hour gone, another fraction of the darkness spent, another step closer to the moment when Ra would rise again in the east, and the whole great cycle would recommence. Time, in that setting, was not an abstraction. It was a physical presence, visible, audible if you listened closely, measurable with a glance. To sit with a water clock in the ancient Egyptian night was to sit with time itself, in a way that required no astronomical training and no specialized knowledge. You simply watched the water fall, and you knew. Chapter 5. The marks on the wall. Consider what it would have taken, in the 14th century BCE, to produce the interior markings of the Karnak clepsydrae. No computer, no algebraic formula, no laboratory instruments capable of measuring seconds or fractions thereof, no tradition of physics in the modern sense, no Galileo, no Newton, no Torricelli, no mathematical description of fluid dynamics, only the sky, the stars, a vessel of water, a lamp, a chisel, and a set of trained eyes that had been watching the heavens, systematically and carefully, for a very long time. The marks on the wall of an Egyptian water clock are the physical record of a sustained observational program that represents some of the most impressive scientific work of the ancient world. Not because it was theoretically sophisticated in the way that modern physics is sophisticated, but because it was empirically patient in a way that requires immense institutional commitment and intergenerational continuity to sustain. To produce those marks correctly, someone had to watch the sky every clear night for at least a year, preferably several years, to average out individual measurement errors and record what they saw with sufficient precision to distinguish the hour marks of one month from those of the next. They had to do this without forgetting the purpose, without losing the records, without disrupting the tradition through political upheaval or institutional collapse. They had to transmit the method and the results to successors who would maintain, use, and eventually improve the instrument. The astronomical foundation of the marks rested on the Deccan system, one of ancient Egypt's most distinctive and consequential contributions to the history of astronomy. The word Deccan comes from the Greek for 10, and it refers to the roughly 10-day interval at which each of the 36 Deccan stars or star groups made its first appearance above the eastern horizon just before dawn, its heliacal rising. As Earth moves in its orbit around the Sun over the course of a year, different stars become visible at dawn because the Sun's position against the background of stars shifts. A star that rose just before dawn in January will, by February, rise a little earlier and thus be higher in the sky before dawn, eventually rising at midnight, and eventually rising in the evening, no longer a Deccan marker for dawn observation. A new star takes its place at the horizon, making its own heliacal rising, and that star becomes the new Deccan. The Egyptians identified 36 of these stars, or star groups, and organized them into a calendar framework. Each Deccan governed a 10-day period. There are 36 10-day periods in a 360-day Egyptian calendar year, with 5 additional epigomenal days added at the end. The Decans became the backbone of the Egyptian stellar calendar, and their sequential risings provided a way to track not just the seasons but the specific hours of the night. Here is how the Deccan system enabled nighttime timekeeping. On any given night, approximately 12 decans would be visible in sequence, rising above the eastern horizon at roughly hourly intervals. By watching which decan was rising, an astronomer standing at a fixed location and looking east could determine which of the night's 12 hours had arrived. The first decan to rise after sunset marked the first hour of the night. The next, rising some time later, marked the second hour, and so on through the 12. The interval between Deccan risings was not exactly one modern hour. It varied by season, because the night's total length varied by season. But within any given season, the decans rose at intervals that corresponded to the seasonal hour, which was, of course, exactly what Egyptian timekeepers needed. The decan system was naturally calibrated to seasonal hours. It produced seasonal hour measurements without any conversion factor. The astronomer watching the decans was already working in the correct temporal units. This alignment was not accidental. The Egyptians developed the decan system specifically for timekeeping purposes, and its 36-fold division of the year, together with the roughly 12 decans visible per night, was designed to produce a calendar that meshed cleanly with the 12-hour structure of the night. The whole system was engineered, not in the sense of conscious mathematical design, but in the sense of being refined through observation and adjustment until its components fit together in a coherent and useful way. To calibrate a water clock from the decan system, the procedure would have been approximately as follows. An astronomer fills the test vessel completely at the moment of sunset, or more precisely, at a defined starting point for the first hour of the night. They sit with the vessel and watch the eastern horizon. When the first decan rises, they note the water level in the vessel and scratch a preliminary mark. The position of this mark represents 1 hour into the night. They continue watching. When the second decan rises, they mark the second hour, and so on, through 12 decans and 12 marks. After a single night, they have a rough calibration, but a single night is not sufficient for a precise instrument. On the next night in the same month, they refill the vessel and repeat the process. The marks they produce on the second night will not be exactly the same as on the first night. Small variations in their observation timing, small differences in how quickly the vessel was filled, small variations in water temperature and cleanliness will all introduce minor errors. By averaging the marks from many nights in the same month, they arrive at a stable set of positions that represent the best estimate of where each hour mark should be. This process was then repeated for each month. In the second month, the same vessel is used, but the water level at each decan rising will be in different positions, because the night has a different length, and because the relationship between the decans and the hours has shifted slightly with the changing season. 12 months of observation yield 12 columns of marks, each reflecting the specific structure of that month's nights. The practical challenge of this calibration program was immense. 12 months of nightly observation required an institutional commitment spanning at least a year without major interruption. Clouds, dust storms, illness, political upheaval, any significant disruption of the observation program meant gaps in the record that had to be filled in by interpolation or by repeating the program in a subsequent year. The temples that maintained water clocks were, in this sense, also research institutions, centers of sustained astronomical observation, whose results were encoded in stone vessels and preserved across generations. We know the results were, in fact, preserved, because the Karnak clepsydrae still bears its 12-column marking scheme. But the original observation records, if they were written down at all, and it is possible that much of this knowledge was transmitted orally, have not survived. We know what was measured without knowing exactly how or by whom the measurement was made. The surviving astronomical texts of ancient Egypt give us partial glimpses of the decan system and its associated timekeeping law. The diagonal calendars, or star clocks found painted on the interior surfaces of coffin lids from the Middle Kingdom, roughly 2000 BCE, represent the decan rising schedule in tabular form, with each row representing a 10-day period and each column representing an hour of the night. The tables show which decan was rising at each hour for each period of the year. They are, in essence, the astronomical database from which the water clock marks were derived. A star clock encoded in paint on wood, a companion to the water clock encoded in marks on stone. The relationship between these two systems, the stellar calendar and the hydraulic clock, was symbiotic. The stellar calendar provided the observational data. The water clock made that data practically usable in non-astronomical contexts. A priest who needed to know the time in the middle of the night did not need to go outside, find the horizon, identify a decan star, and cross-reference it with the calendar. He looked at the water vessel, found the mark nearest to the water surface, and read the hour directly. The centuries of astronomical labor embedded in the marks allowed a non-specialist to tell the time without any astronomical knowledge at all. This is a remarkably modern-feeling idea. We are accustomed to using instruments that embody complex scientific knowledge without requiring the user to understand that knowledge. You do not need to understand atomic physics to read an atomic clock. You do not need to understand GPS satellite mathematics to navigate with a smartphone. The expertise is compiled into the instrument, and the instrument presents a simple interface, a number, a pointer, a water level, that anyone can read. The Egyptian water clock did exactly this, 3,500 years before the atomic clock existed. The expertise of the astronomer priests, who spent years watching the decans, was compiled into the marks on the vessel wall, and those marks allowed any literate person who understood the monthly columns to read the hour without knowing a decan from a doorpost. Beyond the astronomical calibration, there is a geometric story in the spacing of the marks that is worth examining. Even within a single monthly column, the marks are not always evenly spaced. The varying distance between successive marks within a column reflects a combination of factors. The Torricellian flow variation partially compensated by the vessel's taper, the varying length of the seasonal hours at different points in the night, and whatever residual observational errors remained in the calibration data. In some vessels, the marks cluster more closely near the top of the column, where the hours at the beginning of the night are compressed, and spread apart near the bottom, where the hours near dawn are extended. In others, the pattern is reversed. These variations, analyzed by modern Egyptologists using measurement instruments that the original craftsmen would have found incomprehensible, reveal something of the specific conditions under which each vessel was made, the season of calibration, the size of the calibration errors, the specific technique used to compensate for flow variation. The marks, in other words, are not just a reading interface, they are a record. They document the astronomical observation program that produced them, the engineering decisions made in the design of the vessel, and the accumulated practical knowledge of a timekeeping tradition that ran, unbroken, for at least a millennium. To stand in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo and look at the Karnak clepsydrae, which most visitors walk past without stopping, drawn onward to the golden mask of Tutankhamun, is to stand in front of one of the most information-dense objects in the ancient world. It is modest, it is battered, it has no gold on it, but every scratch on its inner wall is a data point drawn from the Egyptian night sky, and the whole pattern of those scratches encodes a year's worth of careful astronomical observation, translated into the precise language of stone and water. The marks on the wall are the oldest scientific data set we can still read. They are still correct. Chapter 6, Night Duty and the Temple Priests. To fully understand why the water clock mattered as profoundly as it did in ancient Egypt, you need to go inside a temple at night. Not the broad sunlit courtyards with their towering pylons and painted columns, familiar from tourist photographs and popular histories of Egypt. You need to go past all of that, past the outer courtyard open to ordinary worshippers, past the hypostyle hall where the great columns forest together in near darkness, past the second inner court and the successive gates into the innermost sanctuary, the naos, the place where the god lived. The innermost sanctuary of an Egyptian temple was, by design and intention, as remote from ordinary experience as it was possible to make it. It was small, often no larger than a modest modern bedroom. Its walls were thick stone, painted with ritual scenes and covered in hieroglyphic texts that described the proper performance of every ceremony associated with the god whose statue stood in the shrine at the sanctuary's far end. There were no windows. The only light came from oil lamps that burned fat or vegetable oil, producing a flickering, smoky illumination that moved across the painted walls and gave the divine images on them the quality of animation, as if the gods were breathing, shifting, watching. Into this space, each morning before dawn, the high priest entered alone. He removed the seals from the shrine door. He opened the shrine. He beheld the divine image, typically a statue of gilded wood or precious stone, dressed in linen, adorned with jewelry, surrounded by the sacred implements of the god's daily life. He performed the morning ritual, washing the statue, anointing it, redressing it in fresh linen, offering food and drink, burning incense, reciting the specific hymns and prayers appropriate to the morning hour. At midday, a lesser ritual was performed. In the evening, a closing ritual sealed the shrine once more. These 3 daily rituals were the minimum requirement, but they were not all. In addition to the daily rituals, the great temples maintained continuous worship through the night, a series of smaller ceremonies, hymns, and offerings tied to the 12 hours of darkness, corresponding to the 12 stages of the sun god's nocturnal journey through the underworld. The theological rationale for this continuous nighttime service was rooted in the Egyptian understanding of the cosmos as a perpetually maintained system. The universe did not run on its own. It was sustained by human ritual action. The sunrise was not automatic. It happened because the priests had performed the correct ceremonies through the night, supporting Ra in his battle against the chaos serpent Apep, who attempted each night to devour the solar bark and prevent the sun from rising. If the ceremonies were neglected, if a night passed without the proper rituals at the proper hours, the cosmic order was weakened. The boundary between Ma'at and chaos eroded slightly. The sun's rebirth rendered slightly less certain. This was not metaphor. Or rather, it was metaphor in the sense that all religious language is metaphor, but it was experienced and acted upon as literal truth. The priests of the great temples genuinely believed that their actions through the night kept the sun rising. The stakes of getting the timing right were, in their cosmological framework, absolute. Miss an hour, perform the ritual an hour late or an hour early, and you had introduced error into the cosmic machinery at the moment when the machinery was under greatest stress, in the deepest, darkest part of the night, when Ra was farthest from the waking world and chaos was closest. This is why the water clock was not a minor administrative convenience in the context of Egyptian temple life. It was a device of cosmic significance. It was the mechanism that ensured the correct timing of the ceremonies on which, in the Egyptian worldview, the continued operation of the universe depended. The practical organization of the nighttime temple service revolved around a rotating roster of priests. The great temples were staffed by priestly philes, groups of priests who served on rotation, typically in month-long shifts. Within each phyle there was a strict hierarchy: the high priest, who performed the most important ceremonies; the lector priests, who read the ritual texts aloud; the wab priests, who performed purifications; and the junior priests, who supported the senior ones and learned the rituals by observation and participation. Each level of this hierarchy had specific duties at specific times of the night, and the water clock was the tool that told every member of the night shift when their moment had arrived. The junior priest assigned to monitor the water clock, to sit with the vessel through the night and announce each hour as the water level crossed the appropriate mark, had perhaps the most important and least glamorous job in the temple. He sat in the small anteroom outside the innermost sanctuary, where the clepsydrae was kept. He kept a lamp burning beside the vessel, so he could read the interior marks without disturbance. He could not sleep. He could not leave the room for more than a few minutes. He could not allow himself to become so absorbed in prayer or private meditation that he missed the moment when the water reached the mark. It was, in many respects, the night shift in its most ancient form, the experience of sitting awake in a silent room, watching something very slowly change, bearing responsibility for a service that would be catastrophic to miss, waiting for hours that sometimes seemed to stall and sometimes seemed to arrive before you were ready. What did these priests think about in the long watches of the night? We have no direct record of their inner lives. The Egyptian textual tradition is rich in religious hymns, administrative documents, love poetry, wisdom literature, and funerary texts, but it is sparse on the kind of personal introspective writing that might tell us what a young priest thought about while watching a stone vessel slowly drain in the small hours of the morning. We are left to imagine. Perhaps they prayed. The songs and hymns appropriate to each hour of the night were specified in religious texts, and the monitoring priest may have quietly recited these texts to himself as each hour arrived and passed, a kind of continuous murmured accompaniment to the water's slow descent. Perhaps they simply sat in the particular quality of attention that comes from watching something slowly change, a kind of meditative alertness that is neither sleep nor ordinary waking consciousness, but something between the two. The desert night outside the temple walls was profoundly silent. The lamp made small sounds, the faint pop of burning oil, the occasional flutter of the flame. The water dripped, the marks approached. Time moved at the pace of a small hole in a stone vessel. There is a description in a late Egyptian text, the Metanic stela from the 30th dynasty, though drawing on earlier traditions, of the 12 hours of the night personified as divine beings, each with a specific character and function. The first hour is the time of entering the gate of the western horizon. The 6th hour is the deepest midnight, the moment of greatest danger for Ra, the moment when Apep's attack is most intense. The 12th hour is the time of rebirth, when the solar bark approaches the eastern horizon and Ra prepares to emerge as the new sun of a new day. Each hour was not just a unit of time, but a station in a cosmic narrative, a chapter in the nightly story of creation and recreation. To the priest, watching the water clock, this narrative gave the otherwise abstract progression of marks a dramatic character. The vessel did not simply tick through 12 identical units. It counted down to the moment of maximum crisis, the 6th hour, and then counted up through the hour of greatest relief, the 12th, when the horizon would lighten and Ra would prove, once again, that chaos had been defeated. The water clock was not just a timer. In this context, it was a chronometer of salvation, a device that told you how close you were to the moment when the universe needed you most. The priest's specific duties shifted with the hour. At some hours, he was required to alert the senior priest in charge of the night, who would then perform the appropriate ceremony. At other hours, he himself had minor duties: the offering of incense, the refreshing of water in a sacred vessel, the recitation of a brief formula. At still other hours, his only duty was to watch and wait. But the watching was never passive. Each mark the water surface crossed was an event, a cosmic threshold passed, a station of Ra's journey completed, a moment that required acknowledgement if nothing else. The social dynamics of the nighttime temple were also shaped by the water clock in ways we can partially reconstruct. The roster of duties was arranged so that the most experienced and senior priests performed the most important ceremonies at the most critical hours, particularly the sixth hour, midnight, and the ceremonies immediately preceding dawn. Junior priests took the less demanding watches in the earlier and later hours, when the rituals were simpler and the theological stakes somewhat lower. The water clock's announcement of the hours organized the hierarchy of the night shift as surely as a modern shift schedule organizes a factory floor. We also have evidence, from administrative papyri, that priests could dispute the timing of events. If a ceremony had been performed at the wrong hour, whether because of error in reading the clock, distraction, or deliberate deviation from schedule, this was a matter of record and potential consequence. The precision of the water clock created the conditions for accountability. If you could not tell the hour, you could not be held responsible for the timing of your duties. If you could tell the hour, if the vessel in the anteroom proclaimed, without ambiguity, that the sixth hour had arrived, then there was no excuse for lateness. The clock made the schedule enforceable. Beyond the major temples, the practice of nighttime ritual with water clock timing extended to smaller cult centers. Mortuary temples associated with royal burials, and the chapels attached to administrative compounds. Wherever there was continuous institutional worship, wherever rituals had to be performed at specific times through the night, the water clock provided the temporal backbone. The scale varied enormously, from the elaborate multiple vessel clocks of Karnak and Luxor, attended by dedicated priests, to the simple single-vessel outflow clocks of provincial chapels, read by whoever drew the night watch duty. The night was not merely the absence of day in Egyptian culture. It was a domain with its own structure, its own theology, its own demands, and its own architecture of time. The water clock was the instrument that made that architecture visible and manageable, that transformed the unstructured darkness into 12 named, counted, purposeful hours, each with its own character and its own ceremonial requirements. To sit in the darkened inner court of a reconstructed Egyptian temple, as some visitors to the great sites of Luxor can approximate by arriving before the tourist crowds at first light, and to imagine the presence of a dripping vessel, a smoking lamp, and a young priest whose entire existence was organized around the passage of water from one level to the next, is to catch very faintly the quality of attention with which ancient Egypt approached the night. It was not a time to be endured, it was a time to be tended. Chapter 7. The alabaster vessels of the wealthy. There is a particular kind of object that appears in every advanced civilization, an object that begins its life as a tool, purely functional, shaped entirely by the demands of the task it performs, and then, over generations, as the civilization grows richer and more self-conscious, and more interested in the relationship between beauty and power, transforms into something more than a tool. It becomes an artifact of status. It becomes a declaration. The tool's form is retained because the tool's function is still required, but the material becomes precious. The surface becomes decorated, and the act of owning the thing becomes as significant as the act of using it. The sword becomes the ceremonial sword. The cup becomes the chalice. The water clock becomes the alabaster clepsydrae. This transformation did not happen suddenly. It happened the way all cultural elaborations happen, gradually, through the accumulated decisions of patrons and craftsmen responding to the particular values of their society. In Egypt, those values placed extraordinary weight on the visible expression of one's relationship to the divine order. Wealth was not meant to be hidden. It was meant to be displayed in ways that simultaneously honored the gods, proclaimed the owner's status, and contributed to the material splendor of the cosmic order. A rich man's household implements were not merely richer versions of a poor man's implements. They were different objects altogether, objects that participated in the sacred economy of Ma'at in ways that humble vessels could not. The alabaster water clock is the most complete expression of this transformation in the history of Egyptian timekeeping. Alabaster, specifically Egyptian alabaster, which is not true alabaster in the mineralogical sense but travertine, a form of calcium carbonate deposited by mineral springs, was one of the most prized materials in the Egyptian craftsman's repertoire. It was quarried primarily from the Hatnub quarry in Middle Egypt, a site that was in operation from the Old Kingdom through the Ptolemaic period, nearly 3,000 years of continuous extraction. The material it yielded was unlike any common stone. It was pale, ranging from pure white through cream to honey gold, with fine banding and veining that gave each piece a unique pattern, and it was translucent. Hold a thin slab of Egyptian alabaster up to a light source and it glows. Not the flat opacity of limestone or granite, but a warm, luminous transmission of light that makes the stone seem to come alive from within. This translucency had profound implications for a water clock. A thin-walled alabaster clepsydrae, filled with water and placed near a lamp, was not merely a functional instrument. It was a luminous object. The water inside it caught the lamplight and redistributed it through the stone walls in a warm glow that pulsed very slightly as the surface of the water rippled from the slow drip of the outflow. To see such a vessel on the floor of an inner sanctuary, in the deep hours of the night, surrounded by painted walls and the smell of kifi incense and the soft sound of oil burning, it must have been, in the most literal sense, a vision. The symbolic appropriateness was perfect. The water clock measured the passage of time in the dark. The alabaster vessel transformed that measuring into an act of illumination. Time, in the Egyptian temple at midnight, glowed. The decorative programs of the finest alabaster clepsydrae were elaborate and theologically precise. The exterior surfaces were carved in low relief, with images that were not random embellishments, but systematic statements of the instrument's cosmological purpose. The most common motif was the precession of the hours, 12 figures, each representing 1 hour of the night, carved in sequence around the vessel's circumference. These figures typically appeared as human forms with stars above their heads, their arms raised in the gesture of offering or adoration. Each figure was labeled with a hieroglyphic inscription identifying the specific hour and, in some cases, the deity associated with that hour, the stellar marker that heralded its arrival, and the ceremony appropriate to its passage. Reading the exterior of such a vessel was, in effect, reading a condensed liturgical calendar of the night, a reference text for the priest who used the instrument, encoded in the very surface of the timepiece itself. The instrument told you the hour inside. It told you what to do about it outside. The baboon figures were among the most theologically significant decorative elements. Baboons, specifically the Hamadryas baboon, whose males produce loud vocalizations at dawn, were sacred to Thoth, and their association with the rising sun made them appropriate guardians of the boundary between night and day, precisely the boundary that the water clock was designed to navigate. But on many outflow clepsydrae, the baboon was not merely decorative, it was structural. The outflow hole was formed through the open mouth of a carved baboon figure at the base of the vessel. Time flowed through Thoth's sacred animal. The hour was born through the baboon's open mouth. The theological statement was integrated into the mechanical function in a way that was seamless, intentional, and entirely characteristic of the Egyptian refusal to separate the sacred from the practical. The figures supporting the vessel, often carved in full 3D dimensionality, crouching beneath the vessel's base, their upraised arms and hands pressing against the underside, were typically priests in the act of offering. The visual language was clear. The vessel of time was so sacred that it required the continuous support of consecrated human hands. The priest who used the clock was symbolically the continuation of the carved priests who supported it, a living figure in a chain of service stretching back to the mythological origins of the timekeeping tradition. Some of the most elaborate surviving examples feature astronomical ceilings, the curved or flat interior of a lid or cover that accompanied the vessel, and bore painted or carved maps of the night sky. The decans marched around the inner surface of the lid, identified by name and image, in their correct calendrical sequence. The hours were personified. The planets appeared in their divine forms. The entire cosmological framework that the water clock was built to serve was depicted, in compressed visual form, on the object itself. To lift the lid of such a vessel and look inside before filling it was to perform a small act of astronomical contemplation, to see, in painted miniature, the sky, whose order the clock was designed to honor. The patrons of these extraordinary objects were, without exception, among the most powerful people in Egypt. The pharaoh was the supreme patron. Royal workshops produced the most lavish examples for placement in the great state temples, but the highest officials of the land, the vizier, the high priest of Ammon, the chief of the treasury, also commissioned elaborate clepsydrae for the temples. Under their administration, or for their personal household shrines, these objects were gifts to the divine as much as they were tools of administration. A high official who donated a beautifully made alabaster water clock to a temple was performing an act of piety, demonstrating his devotion to the proper maintenance of cosmic order, and simultaneously advertising his wealth and taste in a context where such advertisement was entirely appropriate and even required. The craftsmen who produced these objects occupied a specialized and prestigious position within the hierarchy of Egyptian artisans. Making a functional water clock in limestone or clay required skill but not exceptional rarity of talent. making an alabaster clepsydrae with correctly calibrated taper, precisely spaced seasonal marks, and a decorative program of figures, inscriptions, and astronomical imagery that was both theologically accurate and aesthetically distinguished, was a task that required the collaboration of several specialists: the stonecutter, who shaped the vessel and calculated the taper; the scribe priest, who provided the correct iconographic program and verified the theological accuracy of the inscriptions; the draftsman, who translated that program into the guidelines for carving; and the sculptor, who executed the relief work. In the great royal workshops at Memphis, Thebes, and later Akhetaten, the short-lived capital of Akhenaten, these specialists worked together in permanent institutional settings that combined what we might separately call a university, a research institute, and an atelier. The Karnak clepsydrae of Amenhotep III, already discussed as the oldest complete surviving example, is itself a product of this workshop tradition, though made in stone rather than alabaster. It bears the hallmarks of the finest craft production of its era: precise geometry, careful decoration, and an evident familiarity with the instrument's function that could only come from a long tradition of making similar objects. It is not an experiment. It is the product of a tradition. Later periods produced even more elaborate examples. The New Kingdom, with its vast imperial wealth flowing into the great temples from tribute, trade, and conquest, was the golden age of the decorated clepsydrae. Several examples from this period, now distributed among the major Egyptological collections of Europe and North America, displayed decorative richness that rivals the finest funerary objects of the era. The use of polychrome inlay, colored glass or faience set into carved recesses in the alabaster surface, created effects of extraordinary visual complexity. Our figures with lapis lazuli stars above their heads, outflow baboons with gilded mouths, astronomical texts in red and blue ink on white stone backgrounds. These were objects that commanded attention and communicated authority in every detail. The paradox of the alabaster clepsydrae is that its beauty, which was the expression of wealth and power, was also entirely consistent with its function. The translucency that made alabaster aesthetically extraordinary also made it functionally superior in one specific context. You could see the water level through the stone without needing to look inside the vessel. In a dim sanctuary, a priest could read the approximate hour from the outside of the vessel by observing where the illuminated water surface appeared through the translucent walls. This was a small practical advantage, but a real one, and it illustrates the characteristic Egyptian genius for finding solutions that were simultaneously beautiful, symbolic, and effective. To hold an alabaster clepsydrae, to feel the smooth coolness of the stone, to look through it at a light source and watch the material glow. To understand that inside this object that is beautiful enough to be displayed in a museum, there are marks on the interior wall that encode 12 months of Egyptian astronomical observation is to hold one of the most complete objects the ancient world produced. It is a tool, a work of art, a theological statement, a scientific instrument, and a piece of institutional memory all at once. It does not simplify into any single category. It is, in the fullest sense, an Egyptian object. Chapter 8. The problem of evaporation and temperature. Every instrument of measurement has enemies. The telescope has atmospheric turbulence. The balance scale has wind and vibration. The thermometer has the thermal mass of its own construction, which means it takes time to reach the temperature it is trying to measure, and during that time it gives you a wrong answer. The water clock had several enemies, and the Egyptians who used and maintained these instruments over the course of nearly 2,000 years were forced to develop practical responses to each of them, not through formal scientific analysis, which would not exist for another millennium and a half, but through the accumulated practical wisdom of craftsmen, priests, and officials who watched their clocks behave, noticed when they misbehaved, and learned over generations to predict and mitigate the problems. The first and most immediately apparent enemy was evaporation. Water, left in an open vessel in the Egyptian climate, does not stay still. It evaporates, it passes from liquid to vapor, and enters the air, quietly reducing the volume in the vessel without passing through the outflow hole. In the dry air of the Egyptian desert, evaporation is not a trivial effect. The relative humidity of the Nile Valley interior can drop below 10% on dry summer days and winter nights, conditions under which exposed water surfaces lose volume at rates that are clearly detectable over the course of several hours. For an outflow clepsydrae, evaporation from the upper surface of the water adds to the apparent outflow through the hole. The vessel appears to lose water faster than the hole alone would account for. and the time indicated by the marks will be systematically early. The vessel will appear to reach the later hour marks sooner than it should, because the water is being lost through both the hole and the open surface. In summer, when temperatures are high and humidity low, this effect is at its maximum. In winter, when temperatures drop and humidity is higher, the effect is smaller. The magnitude of the error this introduced depended on the ratio of the water's exposed surface area to the volume of the vessel. A wide, shallow vessel would be much more affected by evaporation than a tall, narrow one, because the ratio of surface to volume is higher. This is one reason why Egyptian water clocks tended to be relatively tall and narrow rather than wide and shallow. The functional requirement of minimizing evaporation error reinforced the geometric requirement of the tapered design. A tall, narrow cone was both better for controlling the flow rate variation and less susceptible to evaporative loss than any other practical shape. Priests who maintained water clocks over many years would have learned, empirically, that their clocks ran somewhat fast in the dry summer months and somewhat more accurately in winter. This seasonal variation in accuracy, compounded on top of the intentional seasonal variation in the marks, would have been familiar and manageable, not something to be solved theoretically, but something to be known about and allowed for in practice. A priest who knew his clock ran fast in high summer by approximately half an hour over the course of a night could apply a correction, mentally or by early adjustment of the water level. Covering the vessel's opening, placing a lid or cover over the top, would have reduced evaporation significantly, at the cost of making the water level less visible. Some surviving vessels show traces of fittings that may have supported covers of wood or fabric. Whether these covers were used routinely or only in specific conditions is not clear from the archaeological record, but the option existed and would have been obvious to any attentive practitioner. The second enemy was temperature, and this was both more subtle and more consequential than evaporation. Temperature affects the behavior of water in ways that are relevant to a clepsydrae through two distinct mechanisms. The first is viscosity. Water's resistance to flow, its thickness, in everyday terms, decreases as temperature increases. Cold water is slightly more viscous than warm water. The difference is not enormous. Between 0 and 40 degrees Celsius, the viscosity of water decreases by roughly a factor of 3, but it is real and measurable, and in a timekeeping device where consistency of flow rate is everything, a factor of 3 is not a small error. At the practical temperature range of Egyptian nights, say 10 degrees Celsius on a cold winter desert night to 35 degrees Celsius on a warm summer night, the viscosity variation in water is roughly a factor of 2. This means that the same hole, in the same vessel, with the same water level, will drip approximately twice as fast on a warm summer night as on a cold winter night. A clock calibrated in winter will run too fast in summer, independent of the seasonal hour variation already encoded in the different monthly columns. A clock calibrated in summer will run too slowly in winter. The Egyptian solution to this problem was not, as far as we can determine, an explicit theoretical correction. It was a practical one. The calibration program the year of stellar observations used to place the marks automatically incorporated the temperature effects of each season. When an astronomer calibrated the summer marks in summer, the water was warm and flowing fast. The marks were placed where the warm water, fast-flowing vessel put them. When they calibrated the winter marks in winter, the water was cold and flowing slowly. The marks were placed where the cold water, slow-flowing vessel put them. The seasonal marks, in other words, were temperature corrected by the nature of the calibration process, even though no one involved would have described it that way. This is a beautiful example of empirical science working correctly, even in the absence of theoretical understanding. The Egyptians did not know why their clock ran differently in summer and winter, beyond the obvious fact that the night was longer or shorter, but because they calibrated each season's marks during that season, using water at that season's temperature. The marks captured the effect without anyone needing to identify it as a temperature effect. The correction was built in, invisibly, by the process of calibration itself. The second thermal mechanism was more problematic, the diurnal temperature cycle within a single night. In the Egyptian desert interior, the temperature does not stay constant from sunset to sunrise. It drops steadily through the night, reaching its minimum in the hour or two before dawn. The difference between the temperature at sunset, when the water clock was filled, and the temperature at 3 in the morning could easily be 15 to 20 degrees Celsius. This meant that the water in the vessel was warmer and flowing faster at the start of the night than at the end. The marks placed by calibration, which reflected an averaged temperature for the night, would be slightly off for the early hours and slightly off in the opposite direction for the late hours. The magnitude of this effect was probably small relative to the other sources of error in the system. The Torricellian flow variation only partially compensated by the vessel taper, the residual errors in the stellar calibration, the evaporation losses, and it would have been absorbed into the general background of imprecision that characterized these instruments. Ancient water clocks were not accurate to the minute. They were accurate to, perhaps, 10 or 15 minutes over the course of a night, in the hands of a well-maintained instrument and a skilled attendant. This was sufficient for their intended purposes: ritual timing, shift management, the announcement of hours for which a precision of half an hour was entirely adequate. A third enemy, less physically fundamental but practically significant, was mineral deposition. The water used in Egyptian water clocks, despite the best efforts of the priests to supply clean, settled water from wells or sacred lakes, was not chemically pure. Egyptian groundwater and surface water carries dissolved minerals, primarily calcium and magnesium carbonates, that deposit on surfaces as the water evaporates or flows. Over time, these mineral deposits accumulated inside the vessel and, most critically, around the outflow hole. A hole surrounded by accumulating mineral deposits is a hole that is slowly getting smaller. As the effective diameter of the hole decreases, the flow rate decreases. A clock that was correctly calibrated when new will gradually run slow as mineral deposits narrow its outflow. Over the course of months, without cleaning, the error could become significant. The vessel would appear to tell later hours than the stellar calendar confirmed, because the water was flowing more slowly than intended. Regular cleaning of the outflow hole was therefore essential. This was done with a thin implement, possibly a pointed tool of bronze or wood, that was inserted into the hole and used to scrape away mineral deposits without enlarging the hole. This was delicate work, because any enlargement of the hole would permanently alter the flow rate and require recalibration of the marks. The priest responsible for maintaining the clock needed to be skilled enough to clean without damaging, patient enough to do it regularly, and attentive enough to notice when the clock was running slow and cleaning was required. The relationship between the clock and its maintenance is, in itself, a remarkable piece of institutional history. A water clock that was neglected, not cleaned, not refilled with clean water, not protected from temperature extremes and evaporation, would drift further and further from accuracy until it was essentially useless. A water clock that was properly maintained could serve a temple for decades. The Karnak clepsydrae, based on its physical condition, appears to have been used extensively. There are signs of wear on the interior marks consistent with repeated use and cleaning. It was not a display object. It was a working instrument, handled regularly and maintained carefully. The fourth enemy was biological. Algae, a vessel of water, left in even the dimly lit interior of a temple, will over time develop algal growth on its interior surfaces. Algae do not respect the sacred purpose of the vessel they are colonizing. They grow wherever conditions permit, on the marked interior walls, on the surface around the outflow hole, in the channels and pipes of more complex multi-vessel systems. An algal growth around the outflow hole reduces the effective diameter exactly as a mineral deposit does, causing the clock to run slow. Algal growth on the marked interior wall can obscure the marks, making them hard to read in lamplight. Cleaning algae from the interior of a stone vessel without disturbing the marks required care and specific technique. Probably a scraping, followed by rinsing with clean water, repeated several times to remove all biological material. The frequency of cleaning depended on the water quality, the light exposure of the vessel's location, and the season. In summer, with warmer temperatures, algae grew faster, and cleaning was more frequently required. All of these maintenance demands add up to a portrait of the water clock, not as a set-and-forget instrument, but as a living device, requiring continuous attention from a knowledgeable caretaker. It was as much a practice as an object, a practice sustained by institutional memory, transmitted knowledge, and the accumulated experience of generations of attendants who had encountered these problems before and knew how to address them. The word that comes to mind, considering all of this, is not primitive, it is intimate. The relationship between a skilled water clock attendant and his instrument was intimate, a daily acquaintance with the specific quirks and behaviors of a particular vessel, in a particular location, through all the seasons of the year. He knew how it ran in summer. He knew how it ran when it needed cleaning. He knew the specific sound, if any, that its outflow made when it was running correctly, versus when something was wrong. He was, in a sense, the clock. The vessel was the mechanism, and he was the intelligence that corrected for its limitations and kept its readings reliable. When that priest died, his knowledge had to be passed to a successor. The vessel survived. The tradition survived only if the training survived. This is the real fragility of the ancient water clock, not the stone which endures, but the human knowledge that made the stone meaningful. Chapter 9. The clepsydra goes to war. Egypt was not only a civilization of temples and scribes. For much of its history, particularly through the long centuries of the New Kingdom, from roughly 1550 to 1070 BCE, it was also an empire, one of the most powerful military states of the ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern world. Pharaohs led armies south into Nubia and north into the Levant. Egyptian soldiers marched through the Sinai, across the Jordan, into Mesopotamia. Egyptian garrisons occupied foreign cities. Egyptian administrators governed conquered territories. Egyptian merchants traveled the length of the eastern Mediterranean. Where the Egyptian state went, its institutions went with it. And among those institutions was the priesthood, with its requirements for correct ritual timing, and the water clock that served those requirements. The evidence for military and expeditionary use of water clocks is fragmentary. We do not have a single surviving field. Clepsydra identified as such by its excavation context, and the administrative papyri that document military campaigns are often frustratingly silent on the practical arrangements for religious observance in the field. But the combination of what we know about the Egyptian military's institutional requirements, the nature of surviving water clock designs, and scattered textual references allows us to piece together a coherent picture of how timekeeping was managed in the most challenging possible conditions. The starting point is the religious requirement. Egyptian soldiers were not secular professionals in the modern sense. They were participants in a sacred institution. The pharaoh's army was an expression of the pharaoh's divine authority, and the pharaoh was himself a god incarnate, the living Horus, the earthly representative of Ra. Military campaigns were, in Egyptian theology, cosmic events, the extension of Mahat against the forces of chaos, which in practical terms meant the expansion of Egyptian order against the disorder of foreign peoples who had not yet been brought under the beneficent rule of Pharaoh. A campaign that neglected religious ritual was not merely impious, it was strategically dangerous, because the divine support that made Egyptian armies victorious depended on the correct performance of the ceremonies that maintained the connection between Pharaoh, army, and the gods. This meant that wherever a major Egyptian military force operated, it needed priests, and wherever it had priests, it needed the tools of priestly practice. The great mobile temples that accompanied Egyptian armies, the portable shrines that carried divine images on campaign, that were set up each evening in the camp and served as the ritual center of the military community, required priests to maintain the daily and nightly ceremony schedule. Those priests required a water clock to know the hours of the night. Field water clocks were necessarily different from their temple counterparts. The constraints of military movement imposed requirements that the great stone vessels of Karnak simply could not meet. A field clepsydra had to be portable, light enough to be carried by a single individual, small enough to fit in the kit of a traveling priest's assistant, without taking up disproportionate space. It had to be robust, capable of surviving the physical stresses of travel by cart, by boat, on the back of a donkey through the Sinai desert, without cracking or chipping in ways that would alter the calibration marks. It had to be easy to clean and maintain with whatever materials were available in the field, far from the specialized workshops that produced the fine tools used by temple maintenance priests. And it had to work well enough, accurately enough, to fulfill the ritual requirements for which it was needed, even if its precision was somewhat lower than that of a permanent installation. Ceramic was the likely material for field clepsydrae. Fired clay could produce vessels of adequate precision, and was much lighter than stone. It was also much cheaper. A field unit that was lost, broken, or captured was less of an institutional loss if it was made of clay than if it was made of stone or alabaster. Ceramic was also familiar to the soldiers and support staff of the Egyptian military, who used ceramic vessels for everything from water storage to cooking. A priest traveling with an army could have a ceramic clepsydra made locally by an Egyptian craftsman attached to the military supply train if his existing vessel were damaged. This was not possible with a stone instrument. The marks on a field clepsydra were necessarily simpler. The 12-column calibration scheme of the Karnak clock, representing a full year of astronomical observation, was the product of a permanent installation with dedicated astronomical staff. A field clock likely carried a simplified marking scheme, perhaps with only 3 or 4 seasonal columns representing the major divisions of the Egyptian calendar year, summer, winter, and the intermediate seasons, rather than 12 monthly calibrations. This introduced some error, particularly in the transitional months between seasons, but reduced the calibration burden enormously. There is also the question of water supply. In Egypt, where the Nile Valley provided clean water from wells almost everywhere, supply for the clepsydrae was never a primary concern. In foreign territories, in the desert wastes of the Sinai, in the hill country of the Levant, in the savannas of Nubia, water was sometimes scarce, and what was available was sometimes heavily mineralized, tainted with organic material, or biologically contaminated. The specific problem of mineral deposits clogging the outflow hole would have been much more acute in some foreign environments than in the Nile Valley, requiring more frequent cleaning and more careful monitoring of flow rate. For the soldiers themselves, the water clocks served a purpose that was simultaneously practical and psychological. Military camps required the organization of watch shifts through the night. The perimeter guards who stood watch in the darkness outside the camp needed to rotate on a schedule, and that schedule needed to be enforced with something more reliable than a sleepy officer's estimate of how much time had passed. A water clock placed at the command post, tended by a priest or a dedicated camp official, provided the objective time reference that made organized watch rotation possible. When the clock said 2 hours had passed, the watch changed. This was not a religious function, but a military operational one, and it illustrates how the water clock's usefulness extended beyond its original sacred context into the general administrative needs of any complex institution. The deployment of Egyptian armies into foreign territories also created an interesting problem that the water clock could not fully solve: latitude. The calibration marks on an Egyptian clepsydrae were correct for the latitude at which the calibration observations were made, which was the latitude of the temple where the calibration was done, almost certainly somewhere in the Nile Valley, between roughly 22 and 31 degrees north latitude. When the army marched to a higher latitude, into the northern Levant, for example, which lies at 33 to 36 degrees north, the relationship between the length of the night and the calendar was different from what the clock's marks assumed. A summer night at 35 degrees north is shorter than a summer night at 25 degrees north, and a winter night is longer. The clock, calibrated for Egyptian latitudes, would give slightly wrong answers in the northern Levant, not dramatically wrong, but wrong enough to accumulate into a meaningful error by the end of a long night. Egyptian priests in the field had no general solution to this problem. The mathematical tools required to compute latitude corrections for water clock marks, essentially to recalculate the seasonal hour lengths as a function of latitude, were not available to them in any systematic form. What they could do, if they stayed long enough in one location, was recalibrate empirically, observe the stars at their new latitude, note where the water level stood at each stellar hour, and adjust the marks on the vessel accordingly. This was the same procedure used in Egypt, simply applied to a new location. It required time and clear skies, which a military campaign in the field might not consistently provide. The more likely practical solution was simply to accept a somewhat reduced accuracy and to use the clock as a rough guide rather than a precise timepiece. Ritual timing that was off by 20 minutes was still better than no timing at all. The gods, presumably, could accommodate the practical limitations of campaigning. The administrative use of water clocks in the context of large construction projects is perhaps even better documented than the military use, if only indirectly. The management of the large workforce that built Egypt's great monuments, the pyramids, the temples, the rock-cut tombs of the Valley of the Kings, required a level of administrative precision that is evident in the papyri recovered from Deir el-Medina, the village of artisans that housed the workers who built the royal tombs during the New Kingdom. The Deir el-Medina papyri are among the most extraordinary administrative documents to survive from the ancient world. They record, in meticulous detail, the attendance of individual workers across years of service. They note when workers were absent and why: illness, bereavement, religious festival, or simply being drunk. They record the allocation of rations, food, water, oil, firewood, down to the individual and the day. They record disputes between workers, court proceedings, property transactions. They are, in effect, the human resources file of a major construction enterprise, preserved on papyrus for 3,500 years. What they sometimes also record is the hour at which specific events occurred: the arrival of a delivery, the start of a ceremony, the moment a particular task was completed. This hour-level precision in administrative recording implies access to a timekeeping instrument more refined than solar observation alone. In the narrow, shadowed valleys where the tombs were cut, or inside the tomb passages themselves, the sun was often invisible or its shadows too indirect to be useful. A water clock placed at the entrance to the work site, or in the foreman's shelter, would have provided the temporal reference that the records reflect. The foreman who recorded Userhat, absent from the third hour of the morning, was not guessing. He was reading a mark on a stone vessel and writing down what he saw. The water clock, in this context, had become what we would today call a time and attendance system, a means of documenting and enforcing the labor contract between the Egyptian state and its workers. This transition from sacred to administrative was not a degradation of the instrument's status. In Egyptian culture, the proper management of labor, the fair allocation of work and rest, the accurate recording of time served and rations due, was itself an expression of Ma'at. A foreman who kept accurate time records was a servant of cosmic order, no less than a priest who performed the correct ceremony at the correct hour. The water clock served both purposes, not because it had been repurposed, but because both purposes were, in the Egyptian worldview, expressions of the same fundamental value, the correct ordering of time in accordance with divine will. Each of these effects was small individually. Together, they accumulated. Over the course of a 12-hour night, the accumulated error in a well-made and carefully maintained Egyptian water clock was probably on the order of 15 to 30 minutes. This is, depending on your perspective, either impressively small or usably large. Impressively small when you consider that it was achieved without any theoretical understanding of the physics involved, using only empirical observation and craft skill refined across generations. Usably large when you consider that 30 minutes is a significant fraction of a seasonal hour, in some seasons, a full third of an hour, and that errors of this magnitude could cause a priest to perform a ritual ceremony meaningfully late or early relative to the stellar hour it was supposed to accompany. Experienced attendants compensated for this drift, up to a point, through judgment. A priest who had monitored a particular vessel through many nights knew, from experience, that it tended to run fast in the first hours and slow in the last, or vice versa. He could mentally adjust his readings, treating the third mark as slightly early and the 10th mark as slightly late, arriving at a personal correction that partially compensated for the vessel's systematic errors. This correction was not written down. It was embodied knowledge, as much a part of the priest's skill as his ability to recite the appropriate hymn for each hour or to clean the outflow hole without damaging the marks. When that priest died, his correction died with him. A new priest, starting fresh with the same vessel, had to learn its quirks from experience, which might take weeks or months of nightly observation before the vessel's systematic errors became familiar enough to compensate for. During this relearning period, the clock's effective accuracy was lower than during the experienced period. The instrument's precision was, in this sense, not a fixed property of the device, but a property of the device plus its practitioner, a coupled system whose performance was bounded below by the vessel's calibration and above by the attendant's experience. This coupling of instrument and practitioner was not unique to Egyptian water clocks. It characterizes most pre-modern measuring instruments to some degree, but it made the water clock peculiarly vulnerable to institutional disruption. A sophisticated astronomical observatory, with a library of observation records and a tradition of peer review, could survive the loss of an individual practitioner by absorbing the loss across a community of scholars. A single water clock in a provincial temple, maintained by one priest who understood it and whose knowledge lived only in his mind and his hands, could be effectively destroyed as a precision instrument by that priest's death or departure. The vessel survived. The competence to use it accurately did not always. The second fundamental limitation was consistency of water supply. All of the analysis of vessel geometry, hole size, and seasonal calibration rested on the assumption that the water used to fill the clock was chemically and physically consistent, same temperature, same mineral content, same viscosity, night after night and month after month. In practice, this was never entirely true. In Egypt, where water came primarily from the Nile, the mineral content of available water varied seasonally. During and immediately after the annual inundation, roughly July through October, Nile water was heavily laden with suspended sediment, making it unsuitable for direct use in a water clock. The temples maintained cisterns and sacred lakes, specifically to provide clean, settled water. and the water clock would have drawn on these supplies rather than directly from the river. But even cistern water varied in its mineral content across the year as the cistern was drawn down and refilled, as organic matter accumulated on the bottom, and as seasonal temperature changes affected the solubility of minerals. The practical consequence was that a clock calibrated in January, using water from a cistern filled with low sediment, winter Nile water, might behave somewhat differently in March when the cistern contained water with a slightly different chemical composition. This is a small effect, but small effects matter in a precision instrument. The third limitation was scale. An Egyptian water clock that dripped through a 12-hour night used a certain volume of water, enough to fill the vessel to its top mark at sunset and run it down to its bottom mark by dawn. For a vessel the size of the Karnak clepsydrae, this was perhaps 3 to 5 liters of water per night. Over the course of a year, a single clock consumed roughly 1 to 2,000 liters of clean water. In a civilization where water management was a central engineering preoccupation, this was not a trivial demand, not at the level of a single major temple with 1 or 2 clocks, but potentially significant at the level of a network of provincial temples, military installations, and administrative centers, each maintaining its own timepiece. More importantly, a water clock that dripped for 12 hours could not, by the nature of its design, be used to measure intervals shorter than a certain minimum, perhaps 15 or 20 minutes. The duration of a mark-to-mark interval at typical Egyptian night-hour lengths. For finer time divisions, the Egyptian clock offered nothing. If you wanted to know whether 10 minutes had passed or 15, the Egyptian clepsydrae could not help you. The marks were too widely spaced, and the flow rate variation was too large relative to the interval you were trying to measure. This limitation was not practically significant for the religious and administrative purposes that drove Egyptian timekeeping. Nobody needed to know whether a ceremony had lasted 10 minutes or 15. They needed to know which hour it belonged to. But it was a genuine boundary on the clock's utility that became more significant as time went on and as the range of activities for which precise time measurement was desired expanded beyond ritual observation. The fourth and deepest limitation was the impossibility of standardization. 2 water clocks built in different workshops by different craftsmen using different stone or clay, with slightly different tapers and slightly different holes, filled with water from different sources at different temperatures. These 2 clocks would not agree with each other, even when placed side by side in the same room. Each was calibrated against the stars, and the stars were the same for everyone. But the accumulation of small differences in construction meant that each clock had its own relationship to astronomical time. The hour that clock A indicated when the water reached its 6th mark might correspond to the true 6th hour. Clock B might indicate the 6th hour 10 minutes earlier or later. In a world where each major institution had its own clock and was responsible for its own timekeeping, this lack of standardization was manageable. Temples did not typically need to synchronize their internal time with that of other temples. The administrative records of one institution did not need to mesh precisely with those of another. Each clock served its own institution, and as long as it was internally consistent, as long as it told the same story about the night on Tuesday as it had on Monday, the lack of cross-institutional standardization was irrelevant. But as the uses of time measurement expanded, as commercial, legal, and diplomatic activities required parties from different institutions to share a common temporal reference, the absence of standardization became more significant. The Athenian law court's use of the clepsydrae to measure speaking time made this problem visible. If prosecutor and defender were measured by different vessels, and those vessels did not agree precisely on how much time constituted one full vessel, then the supposed equality of their speaking time was illusory. The problem was addressed in practice by using the same vessel for all parties in a single case. But this was a workaround, not a solution. The mechanical clock, when it arrived in the 13th century, eventually solved the standardization problem through the concept of the regulated escapement, a mechanism that divided time into equal, repeatable intervals, determined by a physical oscillator whose frequency was independent of the amount of energy in the system. 2 clocks built to the same escapement design, in the same period and place, would agree with each other to a degree that no 2 water clocks could approach. This was the true revolution, not the replacement of water with gears, but the replacement of a flow-based system whose rate depended on constantly varying physical conditions with an oscillation-based system whose rate depended on a fixed physical property. The Egyptian water clock could not, by any extension of its existing design principles, have arrived at this solution. The oscillation principle requires a fundamentally different conceptual framework. The recognition that time can be measured, not by the continuous flow of a substance, but by the repeated occurrence of an event. The Egyptians had no framework for this insight. They were embedded in a conceptual world in which time was associated with flow, the flow of water, the flow of the sun across the sky, the flow of the stars' path above the horizon. To measure time was to measure a flow. An oscillating pendulum would have appeared to them not as a timekeeper but as a curiosity, an object that moved regularly but did not flow anywhere. This conceptual limitation was not a failure of Egyptian intelligence. It was a consequence of the metaphors available to them for thinking about time, metaphors rooted in the geography of the Nile Valley, in the theology of the solar journey, and in the practical experience of a civilization that had, for 3,000 years, organized its entire relationship to time around the flow of water and the movement of light across the sky. The water clock was the perfect expression of those metaphors. It worked beautifully within their bounds. It could not transcend those bounds, because no instrument can transcend the conceptual framework from which it emerges. Chapter the 12th, The Long Echo. There is a particular kind of ending that is not quite an ending, a conclusion that dissolves rather than breaks, that fades across centuries rather than occurring at a single identifiable moment. The story of the Egyptian water clock has this kind of ending. There was no single day on which the last Egyptian clepsydrae was filled for the last time and then set aside forever. There was no decree abolishing the instrument, no dramatic replacement event. No surviving account of a priest looking at the water clock and deciding that it was finished. What happened instead was a long, uneven process of institutional decline in which the traditions that gave the water clock its meaning were gradually eroded. The priests who maintained them died without passing their knowledge on. The temples that housed the instruments were abandoned or converted to other purposes, and the clocks themselves either crumbled or were repurposed as storage vessels, or were carried away as curiosities by conquerors who did not know what they were. This process was already underway in the Ptolemaic period, the 3 centuries of Greek rule in Egypt that followed Alexander's conquest in 332 BCE. The Ptolemaic court in Alexandria was a Greek institution, oriented toward Greek intellectual traditions, and while it maintained many aspects of Egyptian religious practice for political reasons, the Ptolemies needed the legitimacy that the Egyptian priesthood could provide, and they presented themselves as pharaohs in the traditional manner. The interior intellectual life of the court was Greek, not Egyptian. The great library of Alexandria collected and transmitted Greek learning. The Mausians supported Greek scholars. The mathematical and astronomical traditions that were most actively developed in the Ptolemaic period were the Greek and Babylonian ones, not the Egyptian Deccan tradition. Within the great Egyptian temples, the traditional practices continued for a time under Ptolemaic patronage. The temples of Edfu, Dendora, and Philae, all built or substantially enlarged in the Ptolemaic period, were complete working religious institutions with the full range of ritual requirements. Their priests maintained the daily ceremonies, kept the astronomical records, and presumably used water clocks for the nighttime ritual schedule. But these temples were institutional islands in an increasingly Hellenized world. The intellectual tradition that supported them, the astronomical knowledge, the craft tradition of making and calibrating clepsydrae, the liturgical practice of the nighttime hours, was maintained by diminishing numbers of increasingly specialized practitioners. The Roman conquest of Egypt in 30 BCE, following Cleopatra's defeat by Augustus, did not immediately destroy the traditional temples. The Romans, like the Ptolemies, found it politically convenient to maintain Egyptian religious institutions, and Roman emperors continued to be depicted in traditional pharaonic style on temple walls, well into the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE. But Roman imperial policy placed the traditional priesthood under increasing administrative control, restricted the resources available to the temples, and over time diminished the pool of young men who could be trained in the full range of traditional priestly knowledge. The rise of Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century CE brought a more active pressure against the traditional temples. The Emperor Theodosius issued decrees closing pagan temples in 391 CE, and while enforcement was uneven and the great Egyptian temples persisted in practice for some time after these decrees, the institutional framework that had sustained Egyptian priestly training, the system of Pharaohs, the transmission of astronomical knowledge from senior to junior priests, the dedicated craft workshops for producing ritual instruments, was irrevocably disrupted. The last securely dated hieroglyphic inscription was carved at Philae in 394 CE. The last known demotic inscription was carved therein for 52 CE. After that, the living tradition of Egyptian priestly practice, including the nighttime ritual schedule and the water clock tradition that served it, disappears from the historical record. The water clocks themselves, removed from their institutional context, became meaningless. The marks on their interior walls, which encoded years of astronomical observation, were unreadable to anyone who did not know the Decan system and the 12-column calibration scheme. The vessels were recognizable as containers. Their function as timekeepers was not. Some survived in temple ruins, eventually buried by sand or debris. Others were repurposed as water storage vessels, as decorative objects, as building material. Still others were collected by early visitors to Egypt, scholars and travelers and plunderers alike, and found their way into the collections of European museums, where they sat for centuries as beautiful and puzzling objects whose purpose was imperfectly understood. The modern rediscovery of the Egyptian water clock's function and sophistication began in earnest in the 19th century, as the decipherment of hieroglyphics accomplished by Champollion in 1822. Building on the Rosetta Stone opened the full range of Egyptian textual and astronomical knowledge to scholarly analysis. When Egyptologists could read the inscriptions on the vessels, the seasonal marking scheme became decipherable. When they could read the astronomical texts and the Decan calendars painted on coffin lids, the calibration basis of the marks became clear. The instrument, silent for 15 centuries, began to speak again in the only way it could, not by dripping, but by yielding its secrets to scholarly analysis. This recovery of understanding is itself a remarkable story, though it is not the story being told here. What matters for our purposes is that the Egyptian water clock, though its institutional life ended in the 5th century CE, did not end there as an idea or as an influence. The influence persisted through 3 distinct channels. The first was the Greek and Roman scholarly tradition, which preserved descriptions and analyses of water clock design in texts that survived into the medieval period and beyond. Vitruvius's discussion of clepsydrae design in De Architectura was read throughout the medieval period by those with access to Latin. Technical texts. Hero of Alexandria, the 1st century CE, Greek mathematician and engineer, described water clock mechanisms of considerable sophistication in his Pneumatica and other works. These texts, translated into Arabic during the Great Translation movement of the 8th and 9th centuries, carried water clock technology into the Islamic world and formed part of the intellectual foundation on which Islamic engineers like Al-Jazari built their extraordinary mechanical water clocks. The Islamic water clock tradition was not a simple inheritance of ancient techniques. It was a creative transformation. Islamic engineers added mechanical automation, float-driven mechanisms that moved pointers, rang bells, released balls into cups, and drove the automata for which Al-Jazari's clocks are famous. They added astronomical displays showing the movement of celestial bodies across a dial face. They added the concept of the self-regulating mechanism, devices that maintained a constant water level in the flow vessel, ensuring a constant flow rate independent of the filling cycle, a solution to the Torricellian variation problem that the Egyptians had addressed geometrically but which Islamic engineers addressed mechanically. These innovations represented genuine advances beyond anything the Egyptian tradition had achieved, and they pointed in the direction of the mechanical clock even as they remained committed to water as the driving medium. The second channel of influence was the monastic tradition. As already discussed, the Benedictine requirement for fixed times of prayer created a nighttime timekeeping need that the monastic water clock served for centuries before the mechanical clock was developed. But the monastic tradition did something more than simply use the water clock. It embedded the concept of the divided hour, the clock-regulated day, into the cultural fabric of European civilization in a way that prepared the ground for the mechanical clock's eventual adoption. The Benedictine rule, in requiring monks to organize their entire day and night around a fixed schedule of prayer, created communities of people for whom clock time was not an abstraction but the literal structure of daily life. Rising for matins in the middle of the night, knowing that Lauds would follow at a specific interval, that prime would come with the dawn, that the day's work was bounded by the successive hours of prayer. This was an existence, organized around the clock in a way that no previous European society had required. The monk was, in a sense, the first thoroughly clock-regulated human being in Western history, and the water clock was his regulator. When the mechanical clock arrived, probably in the late 13th century CE, in northern European monasteries, Though the details of its invention remain debated, it arrived into an institutional culture that already understood what a clock was for, already organized its life around the division of the day into named hours, and already possessed the discipline to treat those divisions as the framework of existence rather than merely a convenience. The mechanical clock did not create the clock-organized day. It inherited it from the monastery, which had inherited it from the Roman institution, which had inherited it from the Greek court and the law court, which had inherited it from the Egyptian temple. The third channel of influence was the most diffuse and the most fundamental. The concept itself, before the water clock, before any device that divided time mechanically rather than observationally, the hour did not exist as an experienced reality. You could observe that the sun was at a certain height in the sky, or that a certain star had risen, or that the quality of the light suggested midday or late afternoon, but you could not say, in any operationally meaningful sense, that 2 hours had passed since a particular event. There was no mechanism to count the hours. There were only observations. The water clock created the hour as a practical, measurable, countable unit of time. It did not create the concept of the hour. The Egyptians had the concept before they had the device, derived from the 12-hour theological structure of the night. But it made the hour actionable. It made the hour something you could wait for, plan around, hold a deadline to, and record in an administrative document. It transformed the hour from a cosmological category into a practical one. This transformation, achieved first in Egypt and spread through the ancient world via Greece and Rome, is the deepest and most durable contribution of the Egyptian water clock to human civilization. The specific instrument, the stone vessel with its small hole and its seasonal marks, was eventually superseded. The hour it made real has never been superseded. It is with us still, in every clock face, every digital display, every schedule and appointment and deadline that structures the organized life of every human being on Earth. We still divide the night into 12 hours, the same number the Egyptian priests counted in the dark of the inner sanctuary, reading the marks by lamplight, listening for the sound of water dripping on stone. The size of the hour has changed. The instrument that counts it has changed beyond all recognition, but the division itself, the insistence that the darkness can be numbered and named and organized, this came from Egypt. It came from a civilization that looked at the unstructured void of the night and decided, with characteristic purposefulness, that the void should be measured. The priests who filled the Karnak clepsydrae at sunset and sat through the long hours watching its marks appear one by one are separated from us by 35 centuries of history. Their language is dead, their gods are museum exhibits, their empire is a landscape of magnificent ruins, but the hour they invented, the hour that the water clock made real, is as alive as ever, ticking away in every device that counts time on Earth, carrying within it the faint but indelible echo of a hole in the bottom of a stone vessel, and water falling through the Egyptian dark. And so we arrive at the end of our long journey through the Egyptian night, a journey that began with the first pale light dissolving over the eastern horizon of the Nile Valley and carried us through temple sanctuaries, royal workshops, military camps, Athenian law courts, Roman public squares, medieval monasteries, and the workshops of Islamic engineers who turned the simple drip of water into mechanical poetry. We have watched the water fall through 35 centuries of human ingenuity, religious devotion, administrative ambition, and the quiet, persistent desire to know, in the darkness, in the silence, in the deepest hours of the night, when no star was visible and no shadow fell, what time it was. The Egyptian water clock was never perfect. We should be honest about that. It drifted, it clogged, it evaporated, it froze in northern winters and overheated in southern summers. It required constant human attention to function at any level of reliability. And when that human attention was withdrawn, when the priests who maintained it died, when the institutions that housed it crumbled, when the knowledge that animated it was severed by conquest or neglect, it became merely a vessel, a beautiful or humble container that held nothing but the memory of water. The instrument was inseparable from the tradition inseparable from the institution, and the institution ultimately mortal in ways that the stone vessel was not. Civilizations end. The clocks they leave behind become archaeological puzzles for later civilizations to solve. And yet we must hold simultaneously the instrument's imperfections and its extraordinary achievement, because measured against what existed before it, against the formless, unstructured darkness of every night in human history prior to its invention, The water clock was transformative in a way that no later improvement on the clock was ever quite transformative again. The mechanical clock was more accurate. The quartz clock was more accurate still. The atomic clock tells time with a precision that would be meaningless to an Egyptian priest. But none of these later instruments changed the fundamental relationship between human beings and the night in the way that the first dripping vessel did. They refined a relationship that already existed. The water clock created it. Before the clepsydrae, the night was a void between sunsets. After the clepsydrae, the night was a place with an address, 12 addresses. In fact, each one named and numbered and associated with specific duties, specific prayers, specific cosmic events in the theological narrative of creation and recreation. The darkness did not change. Human beings changed their relationship to the darkness, and they did so by making something, by taking water, which they understood, and stone, which they knew how to work, and a small hole, which required no technology beyond a pointed tool and patience, and combining these humble materials into an instrument that gave the night its skeleton. There is something deeply human in this act. Faced with the unstructured, the unordered, the immeasurable, the human response is almost invariably to measure, to count, to name, to organize. The night was not threatening to the Egyptians in any simple sense. They were not afraid of the dark in the way that children in portly, understood cultures are sometimes portrayed as being afraid of it. They were theologians of the dark. They had elaborate, sophisticated, beautiful theories about what happened in the night, about the journey the sun made through the underworld, about the nature of the hours and the character of each one. But theory is not enough for a civilization that runs on ritual, on administration, on the precise performance of specific acts at specific times. Theory needed an instrument. The instrument was water. What survives of the Egyptian water clock tradition is both more and less than we might wish. More, because the surviving vessels are extraordinary objects. The Karnak clepsydrae in Cairo, the alabaster examples in London and Berlin and New York, the fragments from provincial sites that speak of a widespread practice not limited to the great temples, and because modern analysis has been able to extract from these objects a remarkable amount of information about the astronomical knowledge, the engineering skill, and the institutional practice that produced them. Less, because the living tradition, the oral knowledge, the embodied expertise of the attendant priests, the craft secrets of the workshops, is gone entirely, and no amount of analysis of the surviving vessels can fully recover it. We can measure the taper. We cannot know the thought processes of the man who calculated it. We can read the marks. We cannot hear the priest who read them by lamplight in the third hour of an Egyptian night 3,000 years ago. What we can do, what we have done, across these 12 chapters, is try to imagine that priest, to sit with him, in imagination, in the small anteroom outside the inner sanctuary, to feel the cool stone floor, to smell the oil lamp, to hear the faint sound of water on stone that was, for him, the sound of time passing, to understand, as fully as the historical record permits, what he was doing and why it mattered, why the temple authorities had decided that someone needed to sit here all night, watching a vessel drain, because the universe required it, and because Ra's journey through the darkness was not something that could be left unmonitored and unaided by the ritual attention of a consecrated human being. He was not, in his own understanding, doing something small. He was participating in the maintenance of creation. The water in the vessel was, in the deepest sense, available to him. The same water that flowed through everything, through the Nile, through the veins of the earth, through the cosmic ocean that surrounded the world. Time was not separate from that water. Time was what happened when the water moved in its ordained way, through its ordained hole, past its ordained marks, in the ordained order. He was not watching a clock. He was watching the world be the world, and he had been trusted with that watch. Good night, traveler. You have sat through all 12 hours with us. You have watched the water fall from its first mark to its last, followed the vessel from the quarries of Hatneb to the sanctuaries of Karnak, from the law courts of Athens to the tower clocks of Rome, from the monastery bells of medieval Europe to the gilded automata of Al-Jazari's impossible elephant. You have met the priests who watched in the dark, the craftsmen whose names no record preserved, the astronomers who spent years reading the sky so that a junior priest could read a stone wall instead. You have sat with the limitations and the achievements of an instrument that was never perfect and never needed to be, because it offered something that no degree of imperfection could negate. The first human answer to the oldest question of the night, which is simply how long until morning. The vessel always answered, not always exactly, not always reliably, but always, as long as someone had remembered to fill it at sunset, as long as the hole had been cleaned, as long as the lamp still burned, it answered. The water moved, the marks appeared, the hours were named. The night was not eternal, it had a shape, and the shape was 12, and the 12 were countable, and the last of the 12 always ended the same way, with the slow brightening in the east, that meant Ra had made it through again, that chaos had been defeated again, that the world had been maintained for one more day by the small, stubborn, deeply human act of paying attention to the dark and refusing to let it be unmeasured. That is what the Egyptians gave us, with their stone and their water and their tiny, careful holes. Not just an instrument, an attitude, the insistence that time, even in the dark, even in the silence, even when no shadow falls and no star is visible, is something that can be known and measured and honored by the act of measurement. Every clock that has ever ticked, in every civilization that has ever kept time, carries within it the faint genetic memory of that first dripping vessel, and of the priest who sat beside it, lamp in hand, watching the water fall, keeping faith with the night. Sleep well, the vessel is still dripping somewhere, in the dark, past the last mark, into the silence beyond the final hour. The morning will come, it always has. Good night.